You have heard the name. It is a name that has become a synonym for wealth, a shorthand for power, and, unfortunately, a lightning rod for 2 centuries of conspiracy theories. The Rothschilds. If you believe the whispers on the internet, this family controls the weather, orchestrates wars for profit, and runs the world from a shadow council. If you believe the Hollywood version, they are the glamorous bankers who tricked Napoleon, bought England with insider trading, and manipulated the stock market into a crash just to buy it back for pennies. But here is the cold, hard fact to start us off. A fact that contradicts almost every popular myth you have ever heard about their rise. Nathan Rothschild, the genius of the London branch, did not make his fortune by betting on the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. He did not witness the battle. He did not ride through a storm to beat the news to London, and he certainly did not crash the stock market to buy it back cheap. In fact, according to the audit of their private ledgers, the Waterloo campaign was almost a disaster for them. They miscalculated the duration of the war. They were sitting on a mountain of gold coin that the army no longer needed because the war ended too quickly. The master stroke wasn't a stock market gamble. It was a desperate, high-stakes pivot in the currency markets to save their skins after the peace was signed. The myth says they are all seeing wizards of finance. The reality, they were a family business that survived by the skin of their teeth, driven by a desperate need for security in a world that wanted them gone. Welcome to Distilled. Part 1, Introduction. Today we are distilling the dynasty to end all dynasties. We are looking at the House of Rothschild by the historian Niall Ferguson. This book is the definitive biography, 1,000 pages of access to the family's private archives, debunking centuries of rumors. But this is Distilled, and we don't just read the book. We check the receipts. The popular narrative is that the Rothschilds succeeded because of their Jewish solidarity and secret networks. That is the story Ferguson tells, and it is a good one. But does it hold up to modern economic scrutiny? To find out, we are cross-referencing Ferguson's history with a fascinating new paper published in the Journal of International Business Studies in June 2025 by Carno, Siravegna, Johnston and Verbeke. They argue that the very thing that made the Rothschilds rich in Europe, their obsession with family, was the exact thing that caused them to fail in America. We are going to explore bifurcation bias, the mechanics of the 19th century bond market, and the truth about that pigeon post. So pour yourself a glass. Let's distill the House of Rothschild. Part 2. The synopsis. To understand the Rothschilds, you have to understand where they started, and you have to understand that their story is not about money. It is about survival. Insight number 1. The power of 5 arrows. Structure as strategy. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in the Frankfurt Judengasse, Jews' Lane. This was not a neighborhood, it was a prison. It was a single, narrow, damp street where thousands of Jews were locked in at night and on Sundays. They could not walk in public parks. They could not say "sir" to a Christian. They were second-class citizens in a world that barely tolerated their existence. Mayer Amschel was a dealer in rare coins and antiques. He learned early that the only way to gain safety was to make himself indispensable to powerful people. If a prince needed a rare Roman coin, Mayer found it. If a prince needed a loan, Mayer provided it. But Mayer had a problem. He was one man in one city. If Frankfurt turned on the Jews, he was finished. So he devised a strategy that would become the family crest, the 5 arrows. Mayer had 5 sons. He didn't just employ them, he deployed them. He sent them to the 5 nerve centers of Europe. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt, the hub. Salomon went to Vienna, the imperial capital. Nathan, the boldest, went to London, the financial capital. Carl went to Naples, the strategic port. James went to Paris, the political rival to London. This wasn't just expansion, it was a distributed network. In an era before the telephone or the telegraph, the Rothschilds became the internet of the 19th century. If the price of gold was high in London and low in Paris, They knew it before anyone else because they were writing to each other constantly in a coded mix of Hebrew and German called Judendeutsch. Niall Ferguson's core argument is that this unity, Concordia, was their superpower. They were 5 firms acting as one. When the rest of Europe was fragmented by war, the Rothschilds were the only truly multinational entity. They could move money across borders when kings couldn't even move armies. Insight number 2, the invention of the bond market. Today, if a government wants to borrow money, it issues bonds. We take this for granted. But in the early 1800s, lending to a prince was a personal gamble. If the prince lost a war or simply decided not to pay you back, you had no recourse. The Rothschilds changed the game. They didn't just lend their own money, they created a market for government debt. Here is the innovation. They issued bonds in pounds sterling or francs that could be bought and sold by investors in London, Paris, and Frankfurt. They democratized sovereign debt. Suddenly, the Tsar of Russia or the Emperor of Austria didn't just owe money to a banker, they owed it to the market. And the Rothschilds controlled the tap. If a government wanted to go to war, they needed the Rothschilds to sell the bonds. If the Rothschilds said no, there was no money, and therefore no war. Ferguson details how they used this power to act as peacemongers. They hated war because war destabilized the bond market. There is a famous quote where they effectively threatened to cut off the credit of nations that were posturing for a fight. They became the finance ministry of Europe. Insight number 3, the courier network as an information moat. Information is the most valuable commodity in finance. Today we have fiber optic cables fighting for nanoseconds. In 1815, the Rothschilds had horses and boats. The book describes their private courier service in vivid detail. While the British government relied on slow official diplomatic posts, the Rothschilds had their own riders. They paid premiums for speed. They had fast cutters, light boats, waiting at Dunkirk to cross the Channel even in bad weather. This network wasn't just for financial news. They carried diplomatic mail for kings and prime ministers. Why? Because if you carry the king's mail, you get to see who the king is talking to. And often, you get to peek at the letters. This gave them what economists call information asymmetry. They knew the news before the market, and often before the monarchs themselves. Part 3, the deep dive. That is the legend. That is the story Ferguson tells, a story of family unity, speed, and financial genius. It is a compelling narrative. But here at Distilled, we don't just accept the biography. We look at the raw data, and when we cross-reference the Rothschild story with modern academic papers, we find that the unity which made them strong in 1815 became the very thing that strangled them in 1915. Let's pivot to the science. The science of bifurcation bias. I want to introduce you to a paper published in June 2025 in the Journal of International Business Studies. It's titled Success and Failure in Family Firm Internationalization: The Case of Rothschild by Carnot, Tsiravegna, Johnston, and Verbeeker. This paper applies a concept called bifurcation bias. In simple terms, bifurcation bias is when a family firm treats family members as assets and everyone else as commodities. If you are family, you are trusted, forgiven for mistakes, and given power. If you are non-family, you are monitored, limited, and treated as a hired gun, no matter how talented you are. The authors argue that the Rothschilds were the ultimate example of this. In Europe, this worked because they had 5 brilliant sons. The family asset was high quality. But then came America. The American failure, the case of August Belmont. We often think of the Rothschilds as global masters, but there is a glaring hole in their empire, the United States. By the late 1800s, the US was becoming the world's biggest economy. The Rothschilds should have dominated Wall Street. Instead, they were beaten by J.P. Morgan and Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Why? The popular theory is that they simply didn't like America. It was too chaotic, too democratic. But the 2025 paper offers a different explanation: bifurcation bias. In 1837, the Rothschilds sent a young man named August Belmont to New York. Belmont was a genius. He was arguably as talented as Nathan Rothschild. He arrived in New York during a financial panic, saw opportunity, and essentially set up a Rothschild branch on his own initiative. But Belmont was not a Rothschild, he was an employee. Because of this, the family in London and Paris never fully trusted him. They treated him as an agent, not a partner. They refused to give him the capital and autonomy he needed to compete with the rising American banks. When Belmont wanted to invest in American industry, railroads, iron, the Rothschilds hesitated. They saw America as speculative. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan, who was also an agent of a London bank, was given massive leeway. Morgan's partners recognized talent regardless of blood. The Rothschilds did not. The paper argues that the Rothschilds failed in America because they could not authenticate a non-family member. They were trapped in their own biology. They needed a sixth son for New York, but they didn't have one. So they let the biggest economy of the 20th century slip through their fingers. This contradicts the idea that they were all-powerful. They were powerful only where their DNA could reach. Debunking the Waterloo myth. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the Waterloo myth. The story goes, Nathan Rothschild watched the battle, saw Napoleon lose, raced to London, looked gloomy at the stock exchange to trick everyone into selling, and then bought everything up at rock-bottom prices. False. We dug into a 2006 analysis by historian Herbert Kaplan and the Rothschild Archive's own forensic timeline. Here is what actually happened. Nathan was not there. The news was brought by a courier from the battlefield, likely an agent named John Roworth, or a gazette delivered from Ghent. The news gap was small. Nathan did receive the news about 24 to 48 hours before the official government dispatch. This was standard. His horses were just faster. He did not crash the market. The records of the London Stock Exchange show no massive sell-off or price collapse on the days before the official news. The market was thin, low volume. The real profit. As I mentioned in the intro, the real money wasn't in the stock market bet. It was in the currency market. The Rothschilds had been commissioned by the British government to supply gold coins to Wellington's army in France. This was a massive logistical operation involving smuggling gold through enemy lines. When Napoleon escaped Elba, the 100 days, the Rothschilds went into overdrive, buying up gold, expecting a long war. Then Wellington won at Waterloo. Instantly, the war was over. Suddenly, the British government didn't need the gold. The Rothschilds were stuck with millions in gold that was about to plummet in value because peace means stability. Nathan's genius was that he realized, before anyone else, that the British government would now need to borrow money to pay off the war debts and stabilize the currency. He pivoted the entire family fortune from gold into British government bonds, consols. He bet that peace would make the bonds rise in value over the next 2 years. He was right. The bonds soared, he made a fortune, but it was a long-term macroeconomic bet on peace, not a 24-hour insider trading scam. The origin of the Satan pamphlet. So where did the lie come from? It came from a pamphlet published in 1846 by a French antisemite writing under the pseudonym Satan, Georges d'Anville. The pamphlet was called Rothschild the Fiend, King of the Jews. It was pure fiction, written to smear the family during a time of political unrest. It invented the stormy crossing and the gloomy face at the stock exchange. Sadly, this pamphlet became the source material for decades of lazy historians and anti-Semitic propaganda, including the Nazi film Die Rothschilds, 1940. When we distill this, we see that the Rothschilds were not magical villains. They were highly competent logisticians who understood the bond yield curve better than the competition. Part 4. The application. So what does the rise and stagnation of the House of Rothschild mean for you? You might not be a 19th century baron, but the mechanisms of their success and their failure are incredibly relevant today. Here is the distillate, 3 actionable takeaways from the data. 1. Build your own courier network. Information asymmetry. The Rothschilds won because they had faster information. In the age of the internet, you can't beat the market on speed, but you can beat it on quality. Don't rely on the official dispatch, the same news feed everyone else reads. Curate a network of primary sources. If you are in an industry, talk to the suppliers, not just the CEOs. Read the appendices of the reports, not just the headlines. Nathan Rothschild knew the price of gold because he was moving the gold. Get closer to the metal of your industry. 2. Beware of bifurcation bias in your team. The Rothschilds failed in America because they only trusted blood. They couldn't scale trust. Look at your own circle. Are you hiring people who look like you or think like you, your corporate family? Or are you empowering the August Belmonts, the outsiders who understand a new market better than you do? If you want to expand into a new territory, a new platform, a new demographic, you cannot micromanage the native experts. You have to give them the keys. The Rothschilds kept Belmont on a leash, and they lost the 20th century because of it. 3. Hedge for peace, not just war. Conspiracy theorists think the Rothschilds loved war. The data shows they made their biggest, most sustainable fortunes during peace, the post-Waterloo bond boom. War destroys capital, peace allows it to compound. In chaotic times, it's easy to bet on volatility and disaster. But the Rothschild pivot teaches us that the real wealth is made by betting on stabilization. When a crisis hits, don't just ask, how do I profit from the crash? Ask, what will be the most valuable asset when the smoke clears? Nathan bet on British bonds when the cannons were still smoking. He bought the reconstruction, not the destruction. Part 5. Conclusion. To distill it all down, the House of Rothschild wasn't built on a magical gamble at Waterloo. It was built on a relentless unified communication network that moved faster than kings. But that same insular unity became their Achilles heel when they refused to trust the outsiders needed to conquer America. They were the masters of the 19th century because they were a family. They were bystanders in the 20th century for the exact same reason. If you want to read the papers we mentioned, including that fascinating 2025 study on bifurcation bias, check the show notes. We've linked the breakdown of the Waterloo timeline there as well. If you enjoyed this distillation, subscribe, follow, and hit the bell icon. Next week, we are distilling the history of the East India Company and the corporate origins of the CIA. This has been Distilled.